The cabin was quiet, the hum of the engine steady, until a sharp cry pierced the air. Heads turned just in time to see a tall, well-dressed black man slammed face-first into the aircraft window by two uniformed flight attendants. His glasses cracked, and blood smeared against the cold glass as gasps rippled through the rows of passengers. "Stop resisting," one of them shouted, though the man had barely moved. Nearby, a child clutched her mother, eyes wide with fear, while others fumbled for their phones, recording but doing nothing. The man's briefcase lay spilled in the aisle, papers fluttering like fallen feathers. No one knew who he was. No one cared to ask. But as one of the cockpit doors creaked open and the pilot stepped out, his sharp gaze locking onto the bloodied figure, the entire flight crew would soon realize the catastrophic mistake they had just made. Miles Henderson wasn't just any man flying first class. He was the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the United States. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, Miles came from humble beginnings. His mother was a schoolteacher, and his father worked night shifts at a factory, instilling in him a tireless work ethic. He graduated top of his class at MIT, built his empire from scratch, and by 40 he was negotiating global deals worth billions. Despite his wealth and status, Miles never abandoned his roots. He funded scholarships for underprivileged black students and created programs to bring diversity into the tech industry. He dressed modestly, spoke respectfully, and never demanded special treatment. But being a powerful black man in America often meant walking into rooms where people only saw his skin before his achievements. Miles had faced discrimination in boardrooms and airports alike, but he had always handled it with quiet dignity. This flight was supposed to be routine, a quick jump from LAX to New York for a private equity meeting that could change the future of his company. He had no idea that today his dignity would be stripped at 35,000 feet, and that his own blood would become a symbol of something far bigger than business. Miles arrived at the gate early, as he always did, never late, never rushed. Wearing a navy blue suit, he rolled a sleek black carry-on behind him and held his leather briefcase in one hand. The gate agent barely looked up before saying, "Economy's to the left, sir." Miles smiled politely and handed over his first-class boarding pass. The agent paused, scanned it again, then narrowed her eyes. "Are you sure this is yours?" she asked, her voice flat but laced with disbelief. "Yes," Miles replied calmly. "Miles Henderson, seat 1A." The agent forced a smile and waved him through, but her eyes trailed him with quiet suspicion. As he boarded, a flight attendant gave him a once-over. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, blocking the aisle with her clipboard. "No, thank you. Just heading to my seat." She didn't move until he showed her the boarding pass again. He passed by a few glancing eyes, some curious, some cold. One man in business attire leaned over to whisper something to his wife, both of them smirking. Miles took his seat by the window, placing his briefcase neatly under the seat in front of him. He let out a slow breath, used to the stairs, used to being second-guessed. He pulled out his tablet and reviewed his presentation slides that could change the trajectory of hundreds of lives. But somewhere in the back of the plane, a flight attendant was whispering into a walkie-talkie. "Passenger 1A looks suspicious. He's acting off. Might be a security risk." Another nodded. "Yeah, I got a bad feeling. We should keep an eye on him." And just like that, the trap was quietly set. It started with a coffee. Miles had barely settled in when the first-class flight attendant approached the man seated beside him, a white passenger in a golf polo, offering him a choice of orange juice, champagne, or coffee with a smile that could light up the cabin. When she turned to Miles, her demeanor shifted like a flipped switch. No greeting, no eye contact, just a sharp, clipped tone. "You want something?" Miles raised an eyebrow, then offered a polite smile. "Coffee, please. Black." She looked him up and down as if the request was somehow a challenge. "We don't have oat milk, in case that's what you people usually ask for." "You people?" Miles repeated, voice still even. The businessman beside him tensed slightly, eyes flicking between the two of them. The attendant didn't apologize. She simply turned and walked off without another word. A few minutes later, she returned, With nothing, she handed coffee to the man next to Miles, skipped over him, and moved to the next row. Miles waited, then waited some more. He finally pressed the service button. Another flight attendant, a young man this time, came over. "Can I help you, sir?" Miles nodded, keeping his tone neutral. "I ordered coffee a few minutes ago. It seems I was skipped." The attendant looked confused, then mumbled something and disappeared. He didn't return. Moments later, a supervisor-level flight staff member appeared, stern-faced, clipboard in hand. "Sir, we've received a few concerns about your behavior. The crew feels you may be causing a disruption." Miles blinked, caught off guard. "A disruption? I just asked for a cup of coffee." The man looked unconvinced. "We'll be monitoring your behavior. Please remain seated for the remainder of the flight, unless absolutely necessary." The businessman next to him shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Miles looked around. No one was defending him. No one questioned the treatment. He wasn't being treated like a passenger. He was being treated like a threat. As the plane lifted into the air, so did the weight in Miles' chest. He tried to focus on his presentation, tapping through slides that once excited him. But each moment brought a new, calculated insult, each colder than the last. When the snack cart rolled by, the same attendant from earlier paused just long enough to ask the businessman beside Miles if he wanted a meal. She then looked over Miles completely and moved on without acknowledgement, not even a glance. He pressed the service button again. Nothing. Around him, the silence of the other passengers was deafening. A few had clearly noticed. A woman across the aisle, elderly, dressed in pearls, watched the scene unfold with slight discomfort, but quickly looked away. A young man in a hoodie removed his headphones and watched intently, but when Miles' eyes met his, he blinked and turned toward the window, pretending not to see. Even the businessman beside him cleared his throat, shifting nervously. "You okay, man?" he asked under his breath. Miles offered a faint smile. "I've seen worse." But the knot in his stomach was growing. This wasn't ignorance, it was complicity. A flight full of well-dressed professionals, and no one would speak up. Then things escalated. A tray of hot coffee appeared suddenly in front of him. The original attendant stood there, practically daring him to complain. Without warning, she leaned forward and barked, "I hope you don't make a mess. We don't have time to clean up after people like you." That was it. The businessman beside him flinched. The old woman gasped softly, but again said nothing. The man in the hoodie took out his phone and began recording quietly low to the seat. Miles didn't move. He clenched his jaw and set the cup down without a word. Years of discipline kept him calm, but his heart pounded like a drum. From the galley, murmurs continued. The crew wasn't done. They were talking about him like he wasn't even human. Somewhere in that cabin, surrounded by silence, Miles sat completely alone, watched, judged, ignored. And high, above the clouds, the tension had just begun to simmer. Miles was still staring out the window when the lead flight attendant returned, this time with a security officer badge clipped to her blouse and a second male attendant flanking her. Her face was stony, jaw tight, and her arms crossed like she had already passed judgment. "Sir," she began, voice deliberately loud so nearby passengers could hear, "we've received multiple complaints about your conduct." Miles turned slowly. "From whom?" he asked calmly. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that," she snapped. "But your behavior is making passengers and crew uncomfortable. You've ignored flight staff instructions and your tone has been confrontational." "Confrontational?" Miles glanced around, searching for any signs of support. The businessman next to him looked down at his lap. The elderly woman stiffened and closed her eyes. Even the man in the hoodie, who had been filming discreetly, now held his phone low, trying not to get involved. "I've done nothing wrong," Miles said evenly. "I asked for coffee. I asked for fair treatment. That's all." The male attendant stepped forward. "We need you to stand up and move to the rear of the aircraft so we can de-escalate the situation. You're asking me to leave my assigned seat? Why?" Miles asked, remaining seated. "It's for the safety of everyone on board," the woman said with an exaggerated sense of drama, as if he were an actual threat. At that moment, Miles made a decision. He slowly reached into his briefcase, retrieved his company ID badge, and held it up. My name is Miles Henderson. I'm the CEO of Henderson Global. I'm a platinum status customer on this airline, and I've been nothing but respectful. She sneered. Fake IDs don't scare me. Before he could respond, the male attendant reached for his arm. Miles instinctively pulled back, and in that split second, the man shoved him against the seat. The tray table snapped open, the hot coffee spilled, and chaos erupted. Someone screamed. A child started crying. The force of the push sent Miles sideways, and then the woman joined in, grabbing his shoulder and pushing with both hands. Miles stumbled, trying to stay upright, but the momentum was too strong. His head struck the window with a sickening thud. Gasps exploded from Rose. The businessman beside him stood halfway, shocked. The man in the hoodie raised his phone, but no one intervened. Blood began to smear down the glass. Miles slumped, stunned, one hand on his forehead. The crew stood over him, breath heavy, staring down not at a man, but at a target they'd already condemned. The cabin went deathly still, as if the oxygen had been sucked from the pressurized space. Miles sat dazed, his temple throbbing from the violent blow. A thin line of blood trickled down his face, dripping onto the collar of his crisp white shirt. The chatter, the engines, the rustle of plastic wrappers, all seemed muted under the weight of what had just occurred. The male flight attendant stepped back, finally realizing what had just happened. The lead attendant froze, eyes darting to the passengers, suddenly aware that more than one phone was pointed in their direction. Panic flickered across her face, but pride kept her spine stiff. "Sir, you refused to comply," she said sharply, as if narrating for the videos now being recorded. "You were resisting." Miles didn't respond. He just looked at her, eyes clear, jaw set, breathing controlled. He was bleeding, humiliated, and surrounded by strangers, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of breaking. A young boy across the aisle whispered to his father, "Why are they hurting him?" The man said nothing, just pulled his son closer, shielding him from the truth. The woman in pearls looked horrified now, finally realizing this was no misunderstanding. Even the man in the hoodie stopped filming for a second and just shook his head in disbelief. The businessman beside Miles stood abruptly. "This is outrageous," he barked. "He didn't do anything. He didn't even raise his voice." "Sir, sit down," the lead flight attendant snapped, turning her frustration toward him. "No," he said, defiant now. "This is a lawsuit waiting to happen. You just assaulted a passenger. This man's a CEO. You think people aren't going to see this?" But it was too late. The damage had been done. Miles reached into his pocket, slowly, and pulled out a handkerchief, dabbing at the blood with steady hands. His voice was low, but clear as he finally spoke. "Call the pilot." The attendants exchanged a quick, nervous glance. "There's no reason to call the pilot." His voice was calm, deadly serious. The passengers now stirred with interest. Some sat straighter, others leaned out of their rows. From the cockpit, the door creaked open. The man who stepped out was tall, sharply dressed in the uniform of a senior airline captain. But his eyes weren't scanning the cabin for danger. They were locked directly on the man bleeding against the window, and those eyes were filled not with confusion, but with fury. For a moment, time stood still. The pilot stepped into the cabin, his boots echoing softly against the aisle carpet as he walked with measured, unblinking intent. His eyes didn't flicker to the flight attendants nor the startled passengers. He went straight to Miles, who sat motionless, blood still dripping onto his lapel. The cousins locked eyes. One seated, hurt but composed, the other standing tall, fury barely restrained behind his clenched jaw. "Who did this?" the pilot asked, his voice calm but ice cold. The male flight attendant opened his mouth to speak, but the lead attendant quickly interjected. "Captain, we had to restrain him. He was non-compliant, aggressive. Don't lie to me." The pilot interrupted sharply. The sudden shift in authority snapped through the cabin like a bolt of electricity. Everyone felt it. The self-righteous power the crew had been flexing just moments earlier evaporated in the face of something far more formidable. But despite the shift, no one else said a word. Passengers who had witnessed the entire ordeal shrank into their seats. The businessman who had spoken up earlier slowly sat back down. Even the elderly woman kept her head turned toward the window, her face pale, with shame or fear, or both. Miles glanced around at them all, phones still recorded in trembling hands, but no voices rose to condemn what had just happened. No outrage, no unity, just passive observation. It was as if the entire plane had turned into a courtroom full of silent jurors, unwilling to testify. The pilot crouched beside his cousin. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Miles nodded once. "Happens all the time," he replied, almost bitterly. The pilot looked at the blood on his cousin's collar, then slowly stood, turning to face the attendants who now looked visibly shaken. "I want both of you in the galley. Now." "Captain," the male attendant began. "Now," the pilot barked, and this time no one argued. As the attendants backed away, disappearing behind the curtain, the pilot turned toward the stunned passengers. "My cousin," he said, his voice steady but firm, "is a CEO, a decorated philanthropist, and a first-class passenger. He was assaulted on my aircraft, and you all just watched?" Shame settled over the cabin like a fog. Miles sat quietly, wiping the last smear of blood from his cheek. Still no one spoke. The silence was louder than any scream. The pilot took a slow breath, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he surveyed the cabin one more time. "Let me make something clear," he said, voice resonating with quiet authority. "There are cameras on this aircraft. Everything that just happened has been recorded. And when we land, this video will be submitted directly to federal authorities, airline executives, and legal counsel." Passengers began shifting uncomfortably. A few turned off their phones, others placed them in their laps. No one wanted to make eye contact with the pilot or with Miles, but there was one thing no one could ignore now. The crew hadn't attacked a random passenger. They had assaulted someone powerful, and worse, someone connected. The pilot turned and extended a hand to Miles. "Come on, cuz. You're not sitting here covered in blood." Miles looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth despite the pain. "You're not supposed to leave the cockpit mid-flight, remember?" "I left because I saw what happened through the cabin cam," the pilot replied, "and because I knew exactly who they were targeting." He helped Miles to his feet, steadying him. A trail of drying blood streaked down the window beside seat 1A, the evidence impossible to ignore. As they stood side by side, the resemblance became clearer. Both men tall, commanding, proud. But one wore a flight uniform, and the other bore the marks of prejudice. The image was seared into the minds of every passenger watching. A man near the back finally spoke up. I thought he was dangerous," he mumbled. "They said he was causing trouble." Miles turned, voice quiet but sharp. "And you believe them?" No argument, no apology. The pilot walked Miles to an empty row in business class and sat him down gently. Then he turned back to the intercom and spoke to the entire plane. "To our passengers, be advised that due to the behavior of our cabin crew, this flight is now under official review. We will land as scheduled in New York, but upon arrival, law enforcement and legal representatives will be waiting at the gate. If you witness the incident and wish to file a statement, you will have the opportunity. If you prefer to remain silent, that is your choice." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle in. But silence has its own consequences. And with that, the intercom went quiet. The engines hummed. The crew remained hidden behind the curtain. And Miles, still composed despite it all, closed his eyes briefly, exhausted but unbroken. For once, justice had a pilot. As the flight continued its descent toward New York, a storm of tension brewed, not just in the air, but in the hearts of everyone on board. The once confident flight crew, now huddled in the galley, whispering frantically, aware that their authority had crumbled. Gone were their smug expressions and commanding tones. All that remained was panic and the looming consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, in row 4B, Miles sat composed, though his head still throbbed beneath the dried blood. The pilot, his cousin, Captain Darren Foster, stood at the front of the cabin, hands behind his back, surveying the passengers with silent judgment. He wasn't just a pilot now. He was a witness, a protector, and, in many ways, a reckoning. Eventually, a soft voice called out from the aisle. It was the businessman who had sat beside Miles earlier. He stood again, this time with firmer conviction. "I'd like to make a statement when we land," he said, addressing Captain Foster. "I saw everything." The man in the hoodie raised his hand. "Me too. I recorded most of it." A ripple moved through the rows. The elderly woman who'd remained silent for so long clutched her pearls and finally said, I should have spoken up. I'm sorry." Captain Foster nodded, his tone still even but commanding. "Every voice matters. But remember, it matters most in the moment. When wrong is happening, silence helps the oppressor." The curtain at the galley shifted. The lead flight attendant stepped out, her face pale, voice trembling. "Captain, please, we didn't know." He wasn't wearing anything that indicated he was important. Miles turned his head slowly toward her. "So, I needed to wear a label for you to treat me like a human being?" She opened her mouth, but had no words. Captain Foster stepped between them. "You'll speak with legal when we land. I suggest you stop talking now." The pilot then turned back toward the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for landing. On behalf of our airline, I apologize to every passenger who was made uncomfortable not by the accused, but by those who abused their power. This flight was not only a journey across the sky, it became a mirror, and what it reflected was ugly, but not irreversible. As the plane dipped toward the runway, the tone had shifted entirely. The victim had been revealed as a leader. The silent had found voices, and the guilty had nowhere left to hide. The hierarchy had flipped, and this time, justice sat in the cockpit. The wheels screeched against the tarmac as the plane touched down at JFK. A collective breath was held across the cabin, not out of fear but anticipation. What had started as a routine flight had become a headline in real time, an unraveling of unchecked prejudice, ignorance, and abuse of power in front of dozens of silent witnesses, now slowly finding their courage. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, flashing red and blue lights were already visible through the oval windows. Several uniformed officers, airline executives, and legal representatives waited at the jet bridge. The silence inside the cabin had taken on a different tone, no longer complicit, but heavy with realization. Captain Foster stood tall at the front as the doors opened. Two officials boarded swiftly. They didn't ask for the CEO. They asked for the crew. The lead flight attendant froze in her tracks, visibly shaken. The male crew member stammered something about doing their job, but the officials weren't listening. They escorted both attendants off the aircraft in silence. No handcuffs, just shame. As they disappeared down the jet bridge, Miles rose from his seat. He adjusted his collar, straightened his blazer, and calmly picked up his briefcase. The bloodstain on his shirt remained, a quiet badge of what had been endured and what had been exposed. The same passengers who once looked through him now stepped aside with hushed respect. Some nodded, others whispered apologies. A few simply looked away, unable to meet his eyes. The businessman offered a firm handshake. "Whatever you need from me, testimony video, I'm in." "I appreciate it," Miles said sincerely. "But speak up next time, during, not after." The man nodded, chastened. At the gate, reporters were already gathering. Word of the incident had leaked, thanks in part to a passenger who had posted the video to social media mid-flight. It was already trending. Miles stepped off the aircraft beside his cousin, cameras flashing, questions shouted, but neither man spoke. Not yet. The time for spectacle would come. In the days that followed, the airline released a public apology. Both attendants were placed on indefinite leave pending investigation. Multiple passengers came forward with statements. The man in the hoodie shared his full video, capturing everything from the ignored coffee request to the assault. It went viral in hours. But the greatest impact wasn't the legal aftermath. It was the quiet conversations happening in offices, classrooms, and dinner tables across the country. About perception, about bias, about what it means to watch injustice and say nothing. Miles didn't just survive that flight, he turned it into a reckoning. A week later, Miles stood at a podium in a sleek conference hall in Manhattan. No blood on his shirt this time, just confidence in his voice and a quiet fire in his eyes. Behind him, the banner read, "Justice at 35,000 feet, a conversation about accountability in the skies." The room was filled with CEOs, journalists, civil rights leaders, and young professionals, many of whom had watched the viral video of his assault and the remarkable twist that followed. He adjusted the mic and looked out over the crowd. "I didn't expect that flight to define anything," he began. "I was just trying to get from point A to point B like anyone else. But for some of us, there's no such thing as a routine flight, not when your skin color enters the cabin before your name, before your status, before your humanity." The room was silent, respectfully so. They didn't know who I was, Miles continued. "And that's the problem. Because respect shouldn't depend on what I do, who I know, or what badge I carry. It should exist simply because I'm a human being." Applause followed, not loud, but steady and meaningful. He looked toward the front row, where Captain Darren Foster, his cousin, his brother in more ways than blood, sat with pride beaming in his eyes. Miles nodded once in appreciation. After the speech, reporters rushed with questions, but Miles answered only one before leaving the stage. "Would you fly with that airline again?" Miles smiled faintly. "That airline needs to change before they earn my business back. But more importantly, we need to change. Speaking up, standing up, showing up when it matters. That's how we protect each other." He turned and walked off stage, passing a young black intern holding a notepad, eyes wide with admiration. As Miles passed, he paused and leaned in. "Next time," he said gently, "don't just take notes. Take action." The intern nodded, inspired. Outside, the sky was open and blue. The city buzzed below, unaware of the personal storm Miles had weathered a few thousand feet above. But from that flight came more than bruises and headlines. It sparked a ripple of courage. And somewhere, on another plane, another man facing judgment would be met with eyes that see deeper. Because of him. Because of that day. Because justice, when claimed, has wings.